He couldn't tour anymore. It was just too stressful for him.
Brian Wilson, the frontman and co-founder of the Beach Boys, has died at the age of 82.
Sad news from the music world today. The Beach Boys' Brian Wilson has died.
The world had barely begun to absorb the news of Brian Wilson's passing when an unexpected silence settled over the people who once knew him best. Newspapers ran his obituary next to glowing tributes. Radio stations dusted off Beach Boys classics. Music historians took to social media, praising the man who helped define a generation. But one person, whose presence had once shaped the very core of Brian's life, was nowhere to be seen. Marilyn Rovell, Brian Wilson's first wife and the mother of his two daughters, did not attend the funeral. She issued no public statement, gave no interviews, and did not appear in any memorial features or retrospectives. Instead, she chose to send a handwritten, deeply personal letter to her daughters, Carney and Wendy, during the week of the funeral. The letter, 2 pages long and written in Marilyn's familiar looping script, was never made public. But it was read aloud during a private gathering by Carney Wilson to a few trusted relatives and close family friends. For the first time in more than for decades, Marilyn opened her heart about a man she once loved, a man whose genius was as limitless as his pain. In her letter, she spoke not of resentment or regret, but of heartbreak, survival, and a lifetime of quiet observation. From the shadows, I loved Brian with all my heart. One relative remembered her writing. But I witnessed the unraveling of a soul that no one, not me, not his family, not the world could reach. It was a quiet confession that carried the weight of everything she had never said publicly. Marilyn had lived through Brian's golden years, the rise of the Beach Boys, the creation of Pet Sounds, and the devastating collapse that followed the Abandoned Smile project. Her letter marked a moment not just of remembrance, but of emotional release. Finally offered at a time when the man who haunted her memories could no longer speak for himself. The letter was dated June 5th. Just 6 days before Brian's death. Implying she had written it during his final silent days when he was no longer coherent, drifting between lucidity and oblivion. Her daughters placed the letter on a table in his home, the very same table where he once scribbled down the melodies that would become Surfer Girl and God Only Knows. It was, in its own way, a closing verse to a love story marked by brilliance, chaos, and decades of unspoken pain. To understand the emotional weight of that letter, one must look back to a different time when Marilyn was just a teenager and Brian was an ambitious, wide-eyed songwriter with dreams larger than life. In late 1962, they met in California, where Marilyn performed in the girl group The Honeys. She was only 15. Brian, a few years older, was already building the sonic universe that would become the Beach Boys. Their romance unfolded during the peak of the surf music craze. But it quickly became more than a typical showbiz fling. Despite disapproval from Brian's controlling father, Murray Wilson, the two married in 1964. Marilyn was 17. As the Beach Boys soared, so did Brian's internal battles. While the world celebrated his genius, Marilyn became the closest witness to his unraveling. Brian would disappear into the studio for days, driven by a creative fire that often eclipsed everything else, including his marriage. Songs like Caroline, No, and You Still Believe in Me weren't just artistic masterpieces. They were emotional snapshots of a man at war with himself and a woman quietly watching the man she loved drift away. Marilyn has often been described as a background figure in Brian's life, but that's a simplification. She was his anchor during a storm that never ceased. As Brian's mental health declined, Marilyn transitioned from wife to caretaker. He spent days in bed, barely eating, retreating into a fog of paranoia and depression, often numbed by drugs he couldn't control. She managed the household, raised their daughters, did everything possible to maintain a sense of normalcy even as their world collapsed. Friends remember her as dignified, quiet, and heartbreakingly determined to protect her daughters from the chaos swirling around them. In private, she would confide that she no longer recognized the man she married, that she was no longer living with a partner, but with a broken mind. In the 1970s, Brian all but vanished from public life. Marilyn finally filed for divorce in 1979, ending a 15-year marriage that had become unbearable, not because of infidelity or scandal, but because of despair. Yet even after the divorce, she never spoke publicly, not during the family battles. Not when their daughters became famous with Wilson Phillips. Not even when Brian's story was being told by others in books, documentaries, and interviews. Her silence became a mystery, but to those close to her, it was an act of protection. She had no desire to correct the record or insert herself into his legacy. She had lived it. That was enough. Asterisk. Years later, it would be Melinda Ledbetter-Knott. Marilyn Hu re-entered Brian's life as his second wife and rescuer. Their story began in 1986 when Melinda, working as a car salesperson, met Brian as he wandered into her dealership. She wasn't starstruck. She was concerned. And that concern became the seed of a quiet, determined rebellion against the man who had the tightest grip on Brian's life at the time, Eugene Landy. Landy, therapist initially brought in to help stabilize Brian, had instead transformed himself into a puppet master, controlling every aspect of Brian's existence. He dictated what Brian ate, who he spoke to, what music he recorded, and even how he dressed. He had inserted himself into contracts, claiming co-writing and co-producing credits on Brian's work. Brian was isolated from family and friends, and heavily medicated, a ghost of his former self. But Melinda didn't run. She quietly documented Landy's abuse, contacted Brian's relatives, lawyers, and the press, and launched a slow legal war to break the psychiatrist's grip. In 1991, with Melinda's efforts at the center, Landy was finally removed from Brian's life by court order. Only then could Brian begin the slow, painful process of reclaiming his independence. Melinda became his wife in 1995 and, in many ways, his life manager. She arranged studio sessions, monitored his medications, and created an environment where he could function without fear. Through her, Brian experienced a late creative renaissance. Releasing new music and making carefully managed public appearances, to the world, she was his savior. And yet in that shadow stood Marilyn, watching from afar. When Melinda died in early 2024, Marilyn knew the end was approaching. She wrote a preparatory letter to her daughters, bracing them for what would come. And then, as Brian's health collapsed, she wrote one last letter, this time to him. He would never read it, but she sent it anyway, placing it where it all began. That moment, simple and private, carried the weight of a lifetime. No interviews. No press release. Just a final, gentle goodbye to the man she once believed she could save. In the end, Brian Wilson's legacy is written not just in the music he gave the world, but in the two women who tried to hold him together, one in silence and the other in defiance. Together, they form the quiet backbone of a genius's life. Holding his chaos in place long enough for the rest of us to hear his song, Asterisk. In his later years, Brian Wilson stepped into a quieter world. One far removed from the noise of surf music, studio chaos, and the psychological turbulence that defined much of his early fame. His 2008 album, That Lucky Old Sun, was a gentle echo of the past, less groundbreaking than Pet Sounds, but more personal, more grounded. It wasn't about impressing the world anymore. It was about speaking truthfully from a place of experience. The songs weren't flashy, they didn't chase the charts, but they reflected a Brian who had lived, who had lost, and who was finally allowed to just be. With Melinda by his side, Brian built a family that gave him something music never quite could piece. Together, they adopted 5 children: Dakota, Daria, Delaney, Dylan, and Dash. It was a low-profile life, intentionally shielded from the spotlight. There were no public stunts, no industry pressures. For once, Brian had a home where he wasn't dictated to by a manager, a record label, or a critical voice in his head. Melinda made the decisions that shaped his final decades managing his tour schedules, overseeing documentaries, and guarding his mental space like a fortress. But when she passed away in early 2024, those closest to Brian began to notice something shift. The man who had always floated in and out of lucidity began to disappear altogether. Diagnosed with dementia not long after Melinda's death, Brian drifted further from the world until on June 11, 2025, he passed away at home in California. The announcement was simple, posted by his family on Instagram, noting only that he died peacefully. There was no cause listed, but no one needed one. It was clear he had followed Melinda into that final stillness. The reaction was immediate and global. Radio stations across America dusted off the classics. Television channels aired old documentaries. Music legends Paul McCartney, Elton John, and countless others spoke publicly about the genius Brian had been. But something else began to take shape too. Amid all the noise and praise, a quieter story began to emerge, the presence of absence. The return of Marilyn Rovell, not in interviews or public statements, but in a single private letter that closed a door only she had the right to shut. His daughters, with Marilyn, Carney, and Wendy, joined his 5 adopted children in releasing the official family statement. No individual comments were made, but a single photo was shared, a family portrait. Unstaged, unfiltered, showing Brian surrounded by his children and grandchildren in the final weeks of his life. There were no instruments in the frame, no awards, just faces and closeness. It was a reminder that the man so many had known through melody was also a father, a husband, a person still trying to find his footing even in his last moments. That photo, simple and deeply human, lingered with the public. It wasn't fame that made it powerful. It was the quiet. Mike Love, who had famously clashed with Brian for years, expressed his belief that Brian had finally found peace. Al Jardine called him the heart of the Beach Boys and reminded the world that while people fade, music doesn't. And yet the greatest final note in Brian Wilson's story wasn't a song, it was the letter. A letter from the first woman who had loved him when he was still whole, still human, before genius consumed him. Marilyn's words, written just days before he died, weren't meant for headlines. They were for her daughters, and for Brian Evan, if he never read them. And in those pages she closed a chapter that no biography had truly captured. A chapter filled with quiet pain, private love, and decades of restraint. If this story moved you, if you believe in remembering the soul behind the spotlight, please consider sharing this video with others who understand what it means to love someone brilliant, fragile, and flawed. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment about what Brian's music meant to you. Your words help keep these stories alive. And for those who stayed with us until the very end, thank you.